Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lockwood, and I'm your host for the Inclusion Bites podcast. In this series, I will be interviewing a number of amazing people and simply having a conversation about the subject of inclusion, belonging, and generally making the world a better place for everyone to thrive. If you'd like to join me in the future, then please do drop me a line to joe.lockwood@seechangehappen.co.uk. That's SEE changehappen.co.uk. You'll be able to catch up with all of the previous shows on iTunes, Spotify, and the usual places. So plug in your headphones, grab a decaf, and let's get going. Today is episode 28 with the title, Finding the Magic. And I have the absolute honour and privilege to be joined by Mark Lee. Mark describes himself as a reformed accountant and magician. When I asked Mark to describe his superpower, he said that it is his ability to create acronyms on the fly. Or is that TCAOTF, I wonder? Hello, Mark.
Hi.
Welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So, Mark, tell me, finding the magic, what does that mean to you?
It probably relates back to, as a teenager, my first foray into business was as a children's party entertainer. And I then continued as a magician at parties and functions. And it's always been my hobby, if you like. Other teenagers, 20-somethings, were going to football or rugby or sports events, and I was going to kids' parties and entertaining them using magic. And it's always been a part of my life. I've been a member of the Magic Circle for over 20 years, and I'm now treasurer of the Magic Circle. So I get to combine my professional experience as a chartered accountant with being a passionate magician as well. And I look back and I realized that I hid my passion in magic from my clients over the years, although my colleagues knew about it, and I was always doing tricks in the pub or in the office, in between client work, obviously. But I kept it secret from clients because I was always concerned it might adversely impact my professional credibility. And since I left practice, after I qualified as a chartered accountant, I was a tax advisor for many years. And then about 15 years ago, I decided, having been made redundant for the second time, I'd focus instead the rest of my career on doing those things I really enjoyed, speaking, writing, and mentoring. And I learned that one of the key things you need to do as an independent person, and indeed it's probably true for all of us, is to share a bit about yourself. People don't just buy you because of your technical experience. And I'm much less shy about revealing my interest in magic now. Indeed, there's invariably a trick or two in my talks when I'm on stage, even though my audiences are accountants. And I frequently point out that if they want to be better remembered, referred, and recommended, they need to reveal something of themselves. That doesn't mean they have to become magicians, though. But everybody should find the magic in their own career, background, experience, passions, life, loves, family, or whatever.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, we talk, in D&I circles about bringing your whole self to work. So you were actively hiding an element of who you are or were for fear of embarrassment, shame, or stigma, or something that you felt it would damage your professional credibility. That's really kind of interesting, and it's magic.
Yeah. I think it's also a function of a couple of bad experiences that I had. One was I turned up at an interview in the days before the internet, so there was no profile of me online, there was no photo of me on the CV, and I sat down in front of the senior partner of a large firm of accountants, and he did that thing he'd been trained to do to try and put the candidate at their ease. So he scanned down the CV and he looked at the interests bit, and under interests I put magic, member of the Magic Circle. And to this day, I remember him looking up and looking at me going, I see you're a magician. I think that says a lot about you. I don't recall where the conversation went from that, but I do know I didn't get the job. And I always wondered if that was because he perceived that maybe I was good at deceiving people and that maybe that was why he shouldn't recruit me. And I think that may have had an impact as to me keeping it hidden for a while. then the other experience, many, many years later, I'd been headhunted. It was before I was headhunted by BDO, large firm of accountants. I worked at another sizable firm, and because I shared the magic with colleagues and friends and with journalists, and I was making a bit of a name for myself in the accounting world as a commentator. And in those days, there was a publication, which is now only available online, Accountancy Age, which we used to joke was a bit like the Sun of the accountancy world. No offense to the serious publication that it is these days. But the back cover always had a taking stock page, which is a bit like sort of accountancy version of Private Eye, poking fun at stuffy old accountants. But they always had a feature on accountants who were a little bit unusual, who had interesting hobbies. And I had featured on the back cover 2 or 3 times. And I remember one occasion, I walked into my largest client's office, the finance director, with a couple of colleagues. And as I walked in, I could see that on the notice board behind him was pinned the latest back cover from Accountancy Age with a picture of me doing a magic trick circled in big red ink and an arrow pointing at it going, "Should we take tax advice from this guy?" I went, "Oh my God." And they knew me well enough. It was a wind up, but for that split second, I had thought that I damaged not only my credibility, but risked the client to the firm. And I think that also made me a little reluctant to share the magic too much with clients for far too long, looking back. Because the other thing I've learned as I've got older and wiser is most people love magic. Most people like the entertainment side of it. And it's always about being entertaining. It's never about being clever or I can do stuff you can't do. It's about entertaining with magic. And most people like it, love it. And it might well have helped cement more client relationships than I would have lost. So I think it's a huge mistake when I look back.
Yeah, I'm almost sat here speechless just listening to that story, because for it to carry that kind of stigma. But then I think the way you described it was magic could be your practice of being deceitful, at misleading people. So I suppose it is a bit of this paradox between a trusted accountant and a magician. I mean, obviously we often want our tax advisors to magic our tax away, but we want to do it in plain view.
I've never heard that one before today.
No?
No. So tongue very firmly in cheek.
Okay. Please magic away my tax. Yeah. I see you have your wand. I mean, for those, this is a podcast, but Mark has actually sat there with a bookshelf behind him, and on the bookshelf is a magic wand, sort of strategically placed, just ready to magic people's accounts.
Well, I haven't been in practice for many, many years, but there is often a magic wand behind me just because it prompts conversation. And also for those people who like to study bookshelves, almost all of the books on the shelf are business related, lead generation, marketing, the sort of things that I talk to firms of accountants about from a strategic perspective, or coaching and mentoring, which I do with individual accountants, particularly those running their own practices. But if you look carefully, you will also see the Paul Daniels Adult Magic book. And also I can't remember why I put it there, but I've got the I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue anthology there as well, just to show that I'm not all about the serious and the heavyweight.
It's really interesting. This has sparked a memory that I'd forgotten all about. I did my first magic gig when I was about 8 or 9 years old.
Wow.
And my parents were very keen at the time for me not to be paid, because they didn't want to make me a professional magician at the age of 8 or 9.
Oh my goodness.
It was my, I think it was 8 or 9, maybe 10. I was very young. I remember it was our next door neighbor. They had younger children, and they knew that I did some magic tricks. I had my, was it hanky panky magic
You've
box?
Never told me this.
I forgot all about it until you mentioned it. I forgot all about it. So that they knew I did sort of this magic, and I used to get these magic boxes. It was a hanky panky magic set. So I used to have a blue one and a green one. There's a bigger one you can get, or the little things. So I was quite into it at the time. And they asked me if I'd be a magician at their children's party next door. There's about 8 or 10 kids. And I remember doing it, practicing all these little tricks and obviously fluff them up a little bit. But my audience were probably 5 or 6, so it was probably an easy audience. And so I did my first magic gig at probably the age of 8 or 9.
Well,
no idea why I didn't pursue it. It was one of those things I did, and it dropped away when maybe in my teenage years.
Well, I'm impressed. I did my first gig for my sister when I was about 13, and then I got a booking for a cousin's daughter when she was going to be 6. And the cousin asked how much I wanted to charge. And I had absolutely no idea. And so I said, remember, this was a long time ago. I said, how does 25p an hour sound? Which I can see the smile on your face. It might not sound like much, but it's 25p more than I'm being paid today. And then I realized that, hang on, a children's party is only 2 or 3 hours. And we agreed to round it up to £1. So my first professional fee was £1. Still remember it. And I still have that pound here today. No, I don't.
But not to show your age, back in those days, it was a paper pound, wasn't it?
Yeah, it probably was.
It was one of these big paper pounds.
Yeah, they're not. No, it was the 5. It was the 5s that were that big, and I don't remember those. Yeah. No, I'm only a few years older than you.
But I used to work with somebody when I worked for Coates Bank back in the mid to late 90s, and I used to work with a fellow there who was he was in the magic circle, a magician, and he would always do magic randomly during the day. I was in IT and in computing, so there's a lot of time sitting around watching stuff load or when we're installing things. So there's always a lot of time to kill. And I remember one weekend we were doing this major upgrade, and he taught me how to juggle three balls. I can't do probably more than 6 or 7 cycles of the 3 balls, but he taught me to juggle in the lunch hour. So I know the theory now. I've just got to practice it to make it work.
It's like all these things, isn't it? Practice makes. I was going to say practice makes perfect. Practice makes permanent. But if you don't get good training or good teaching, good encouragement, then practicing stuff just makes your habits permanent. Doesn't necessarily make you a good performer of any kind.
Yeah, I've always been a little bit envious of people who can juggle, because it's such a great little party trick. You can just sort of go, oh, there's a fruit bowl there. They just a couple of apples, couple of oranges, and before you know it, they've got 5 or 6 things going around. You think, that's quite good. I mean, that and playing the saxophone are my 2 want to be able to do skills.
I can understand that. I always feel a little bit alienated when people start talking about juggling as a link directly from magic, because they're 2 very different skills, and I can't juggle.
You can't juggle.
I play the saxophone.
This person was a magician, a member of the Magic Circle, and he taught me to juggle. So there are different things. You're right. I think he showed me some coin tricks and how to roll the coin on the back of your knuckles and stuff, which isn't really magic. It's just
good manipulation,
dexterity, and practicing
dexterity. I look back and realise that I pretty much stopped doing as much magic when I left practice and went out by myself. Again, when I initially started going to business networking events, again, I didn't want to distract people talking about the magic side of my activities as distinct from my business activities. And as the years passed and I stopped going to generic business networking events and focused only on events with accountants, it became less important to me to be doing magic, to be remembered. So these days it figures in my talks, often as examples of how to be better remembered, referred and recommended, how to stand out from the crowd, from your competitors and from the pack. And I will then often produce a pack of cards and use that as an analogy for how we remember what stands out. So a different coloured back card to all the others, for example. And then I will always, it's a bit of a cheat. This was in the days when we could do live events. It just wouldn't.
I remember those days.
It wouldn't work on a Zoom or online. I don't think. I would always say, look, it's a rule of the magic. You've heard as part of the introduction, I'm treasurer of the Magic Circle, and it's a rule of the Magic Circle that if you're on stage, you have to perform a magic trick. Would it be okay for me to perform a trick for you? I always ask the audience's permission, and they would say yes. And that's why there will always be one or two tricks during the talk, not so that they will remember me as a magician, but hopefully they'll remember. Well, they do remember it was entertaining and the magic they enjoyed. And it often includes a trick at the end where I use a deck of cards to summarize many of the key points I've made. And that also makes it a useful reminder at the end of a talk.
Because magic, it's all about the setup, isn't it? You do something very early on.
Well, I wouldn't say it's all about that. No.
Right. At the end, you then bring this thing that you've already introduced right at the beginning. So you misdirect people right at the beginning and then produce it at the end. That's how I would
it's like a well-structured talk, a well-structured routine, well-structured talk. There are a lot of similarities, and a lot of the skills I bring to speaking on stage or even on camera have evolved from the fact that I was speaking to that most difficult of audiences from a very relatively early age as a teenager. And if you can stand up and entertain and talk to 20, 30, 40, 50 kids or hundreds on a couple of occasions, then standing in front of a group of accountants is really not a challenge. Particularly, I found as I got older and more confident in myself as a person.
In my naivety, I would say the stereotype magician tends to be a white man. We look at Paul Daniels, we look at some of the big superstars, they tend to be men. And the women, dare I say, were accessories.
Historically.
They were looking good and catching the bullet in their mouth, having the knife thrown at their head. I mean, that's beyond magicians, but it's all kind of that entertainment thing. Yeah.
Thank goodness things changed enormously. I think it's 20, 25 years ago, the Magic Circle allowed women to join in their own right. And we have the Young Magicians Club as well, and some wonderful female members of both the Young Magicians Club and the Magic Circle. Indeed, one of the graduates from the Young Magicians Club into the Magic Circle became our first female secretary of the Magic Circle in her mid-20s, and she's now the first female vice president of the Magic Circle. And she's a wonderful, I'm going to say young lady. She's a wonderful lady, wonderful performer, great person, and a great role model for other women who aspire to be in magic. And Britain's Got Talent's also been very good at it. We've had a huge number of women take part on Britain's Got Talent. And also, just in terms of diversity, just this year, one of the finalists was a guy called Richard Essien. He's a member of the Magic Circle, also known as Magical Bones. And he told a fabulous story about how he'd been inspired by the first black magician to come across, I think, from America to the UK. And seeing a great magician who also happens to be a person of colour, is a great thrill. As you said before, I recognise that I could be seen as just another old white bloke. For some years, not just in the Magic Circle, but I'm on the members of commercial board of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. You know me through my involvement at the Professional Speaking Association. For some years, I've recognised the importance of diversity and inclusion, and have helped organisers of events recognise that the default choice of an old white bloke is not is not necessarily the right route to go. And before we started recording, we were talking about unconscious bias. And one of the reasons why that happens in my experience is because most old white blokes who are organising things only know old white blokes and spreading their wings. So I'm delighted to have introduced women, people of colour to be speakers. It means I don't get as many gigs as I might have done. But frankly, I might just as well be losing them to a more diverse range of speakers or presenters as to younger white people. The thing is to make everybody more aware of the breadth of experience and ability out there. And that doesn't mean limiting ourselves to the historic approach that's always been adopted in the past.
And also sometimes it's nice to have someone else entertain you and enlighten you for a change, and not always be the one that's doing the performing. It's nice to sometimes take a back seat and see younger people come through.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't abide any unfairness or abuse of power. And I know that I sense that I feel more strongly about that than many other people of my generation, both in terms of racism, sexism, diversity generally. And I think that is a function of something that I very rarely talk about, which is the fact that I'm white on the outside, but I'm still potentially subject to racism because I'm Jewish. And I don't wear it on my sleeve. It rarely comes up in conversation. And I'm fortunate I've suffered very little overt racism, but I still think it makes me aware of the tendency towards it and how awful it is when it happens. Sadly, I know plenty of people who have suffered directly. And I'm aware that I'm fortunate to, I believe the expression I only heard in recent years, passing white. So people don't assume that I would be a subject of racism unless they know my religion, which is an accident of birth parents of community that I might feel a part of. It didn't change who I am, didn't change what I do. And the level of my involvement, commitment and practice, which has changed enormously, both up and down over the years, has no bearing on who I am, what I do, or how anybody engages with me. And I don't see why somebody's colour, race, gender, or whatever else should impact the way that people engage with them in the same way.
It's very true. And I meet a lot of people who have call it a minority characteristic or something about them that is not typical or the majority in the world. And they are always more sensitive and more aware of the impact, as you say, of racism, sexism, and the need to be inclusive. It's often the case where people have never had that experience, that they don't see the need to be thoughtful of it.
Absolutely.
And they're not aware.
Yeah.
They just are. It's not their fault. It's just they've never had to wake up and think about it. And
I'm sure that's absolutely right. I love the statistic that on average, the average human has less than two eyes.
Yes,
and that's because nobody's got more than two, but there are some people with only one, or are blind and have none. And I'm not sure why I thought that was relevant, but
I think also the other statistic is that on average, humans have less than one testicle.
Yes.
Which I also thought was quite an interesting concept.
Yes, possibly more relevant. Yes. Yeah.
And people look at you and go, and then they work it out and think, oh yeah, I get it now. Yeah, it's kind of because not every man has two, and half the population don't have any. So yeah, it's ding, your dinner's ready.
I have no idea what or where that was. I think it was ALEXA, but I'm not going to say the name.
Good, a bit of a ping.
Yeah,
we could talk to ALEXA later.
Yeah, let's try not to.
The acronyms again, isn't it? Yeah. So yeah, you're not practicing accountant anymore, but you obviously through your tax advice network, you're working with, I presume, practicing tax advisors and accountants. Do you see that industry changing? Because when I first came across the accountancy practice, which was probably in the early to mid 90s, where my best friend, who ended up being my business partner and my accountant, always positioned himself as an accountant with attitude. An accountant was different.
Love it.
Wanted to bust this myth of this stale old accountant. He wanted to come and shake it all up and give a bit of real passion and personality into the profession. So, do you see that kind of evolving, or do you still think there's a lot of?
There's a lot to be done, but it has evolved enormously. When I first qualified, the small firm of accountants I worked with, I think the women almost exclusively were secretaries or receptionists. Certainly, there would have been a tiny minority of women trainees. I've just remembered there was at least one, because we've just time of recording, we're just past the 40th anniversary of losing John Lennon, and I remember Roger Scott, the Capital Radio DJ. And we must have had this playing in the background. We were doing the audit of a British Legion club, and I was there as a manager with a younger lady who was a trainee. I remember Roger Scott saying, and of course we'll always remember where we were when we heard the sad news of John Lennon's death, just like we did when sorry, I've no idea where the ding is coming from. I'd stop it if I could.
Don't worry.
Yeah. Just like we did when we heard that Elvis had died, or JFK. I don't think I would have remembered if Roger Scott hadn't announced that. But there was a young lady with me, so we must have had trainees there. And I then worked at a very large firm of accountants, then called Touche Ross. It's now Deloitte. And I remember the first female partner there was pregnant, and I believe she was out of the office at the time of the birth for less than a month, in terms of both before and after, possibly because at that time she was concerned about the impact on her career if she took what we now recognise to be quite reasonable maternity leave. And a huge change. My son works for KPMG, and not only do they give maternity leave, they give paternity leave there, amazingly generous, things that just wouldn't have happened 30, 40 years ago. And I look at the people I'm connected with on LinkedIn, the 11, 12,000 connections I have there. Many of them in fact, the majority of them are probably accountants. But there's a huge number of women, and many who are accountants or bookkeepers or tax advisors, many of them making a point, not only of the fact that obviously they are a woman, but also that they've got attitude, and well, clearly they are different to the stereotype. The sad thing is that stereotype goes back as far, not just of the Monty Python classic sketch about the accountant who wanted to be a lion tamer but wasn't allowed to be because he was too boring. There was also a classic Two Ronnies sketch with Mr. Simpkins from accounts, whose kids were known as Simpkins and Simpkins. And that also really took the mick out of accountants. But even back in those days, that stereotype, which has persisted in many people's minds, it's not necessarily about the accountants all being boring. It's the fact that a lot of people consider the accounting and bookkeeping work to be boring. Therefore, if somebody likes or chooses to do that work, by definition, they must be boring. I don't buy that. I don't accept that. And I encourage accountants to stand out from the crowd and show that they're not boring either, because people want their accounts and books and tax work done. But generally they want it done by somebody they can relate to and who relates to them and will help them, support them, encourage them and advise them beyond just doing the compliance paperwork. And too many people...
I completely agree. I mean, as a small business person myself, I've run small businesses for 25, 30 odd years. So an accountant to me is more than just that compliance. It's just the bookkeeping, the VAT returns, company formations, statutory accounts, all that kind of stuff. It's just a minority. It's that watching eye, that consultancy element that accountancy bring. And how they understand your business or have an appreciation of other businesses, and then can use that expertise to come to yours and advise you and signpost you or mentor you. And I think that's the power, certainly from a small business perspective.
Of course, it should be, but many small businesses don't appreciate they can get all that from their accountant. If they've had a bad accountant in the past, they may move to another accountant who operates in much the same way but is cheaper, and they don't know what more they could be getting. So going back to the title you chose for this podcast, I'd encourage listeners to look at finding the magic in their accountants and getting more from their accountants. But you have to pay for that. You don't. If you pay you pay peanuts, you get monkeys.
But I mean, we're professional speakers, we're professional trainers and podcasters and advisors ourselves. So we appreciate our own brand value and what we do. So of course we're the converted, so we understand about value and what we can offer. As you're talking now, I listened about. Is there still a perception amongst clients that a man is a better accountant? Maybe not. Maybe women are becoming more successful. They're holding higher, more senior positions in accountancy. But is there still this incumbent male crust, if you like, in the clients that women are taken less seriously? Have we still got to try and break through that?
I've no idea, but I would say my accountant is a woman, and I think these days people recognise they need to choose somebody to whom they can relate. And I've often suggested to some of the female accountants and bookkeepers I know, because you and I recognise the benefits of having a niche or a clarity of focus as regards your target audience. And it doesn't make any difference to an accountant what gender their client is. But many female entrepreneurs, business owners may relate better to a female accountant than they will to a male accountant. And thank goodness there's greater choice for them now than there was before. And it shouldn't, the gender of your accountant obviously shouldn't matter. It's irrelevant. But frankly, in the same way, you mentioned my tax advice network, which is an online website, lead generation website for accountants and tax advisors. And I always point out to the members who join, put a photo up there, because you and I, speaking to the tax advisors, you and I know it shouldn't matter what you look like. The quality of your advice is what matters. But I've had this network online for 13 years, and there is no doubt that the advisors in the network who put up a decent profile photo of themselves with a nice welcoming smile get more business than those who put no photo up or just put a logo there or a very poorly thought through profile photo. And of course, exactly the same is true on LinkedIn and social media as well, and on personal websites. And in fact, given the sort of nature of this podcast, I'm reminded also of a conversation I've had when I've been mentoring accountants. I had a black guy accountant who, let's say, his name was Steve, and because his first name was an English name, his surname was a very African name. And when I first met him, he didn't have his photo on his website. And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because I don't want to put people off," because he was conscious of the prospect of racism. So he didn't have his surname on his website, didn't have a photo on his website. I said, "Do you ever get racists coming into your office?" He said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "Well, I've got to say, Steve, why don't you put your full name and your photo on your website so that you don't have to waste your time with any racists? Because you're not, sadly, they're not going to change their mind just because they've met you. If they're a racist, they're racist until they get to know better. But you're wasting your time with racists by letting them come and see you and then find excuses not to engage with you. And even if they do engage with you, if underlying that they're still a racist, do you really want them as clients? And he took my advice on that and on many other things, has not looked back. He's gone on to win awards for his accountancy firm. He credits me with all manner of things, most of which are entirely down to him rather than me. But I gave him the confidence to reveal who he really was rather than to hide it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm transgender. I made a decision very early on to be professionally trans, rather than hide it, rather than say I'm not. And then be found out, outed, confuse people at a later date. I even put it on my CV when I apply for roles, because I don't want you to I don't want you to interview me and then go, oh, actually, we're not sure. I'd rather you just walked on by and put my CV in the waste pile. You don't waste my time. I never get to meet you. I just get rejected like everybody else. So I don't need to care about your
prejudices,
discrimination, prejudices, whatever. Yeah. So I end up working with people who want to work with me, and people seek me out to engage with me because they like what I do, because of who I am. So it's that bringing your whole self to work, isn't it? Because of my lived experience, because of who I am, the insight that I bring. You're saying about your Jewishness on the inside that people may not know, your magic, your diversity of thought that you have around your lived experience. You'll bring all of that expertise into the room, not just this tiny little piece. You're able to share much more. And that makes you more relatable. And people actually know you. They can trust you because you are open about who you are.
I'd like to think so. I remember that conversation with the friend I'm calling Steve was helped by, I was running a round table group of sole practitioner accountants, and there was an Orthodox Jewish guy there who wore a skull cap. And I hadn't been thinking of him when I said what I said, but he chipped in afterwards and said, that is why there is a video of me wearing my skull cap front and center of my website. Because if somebody is anti-Semitic, I don't want them anywhere near my office. There's no point me hiding it and then they come in and I've got to deal with that. That's not going to make my day.
Yeah, I mean, as we're talking about being Jewish, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a conference to speak in Tel Aviv last summer. And I was entertained. There was no fee apart from my expenses and the promise of a good holiday while I was there. And so I actually had a 5-day stay in Tel Aviv.
Oh, wonderful.
One day was conference, and I was royally entertained. Taken to the Dead Sea. I swam or floated in the Dead Sea. I went to there's a fort on top of the hill. Was it Mashhad or Marshall, something like that? Masada, that's it, which is actually below sea level, isn't it? Still, even at the top of a mountain.
My knowledge of such things is not what one might expect.
Yeah. And I think it overlooked the Dead Sea or overlooked Jordan. You can see Jordan from the top, and it was a Roman fort or something that was barricaded many centuries ago. So we had a fantastic time, and it really surprised me about the culture there. To learn about the real people's lives, because we were spending time with real people, not just in a touristy way, but in a kind of a businessy sense. And also we were going out in the evenings with families to understand the culture. So it's really interesting to get to know people and just to know their culture as people, because often we see all the media bias, we hear all this stuff that goes on. You don't get to know the real people. And to listen to their stories about how they were living in fear, we went around Jerusalem, and I was in Jerusalem probably 20 or 30 years ago. But this time I went back, the borders had moved. There was areas of Jerusalem I couldn't go anymore. And if you go to the Wailing Wall, you go to the tunnels under the castle in Jerusalem. When you come out the other side, you end up actually in the Palestinian part, Jerusalem now, whereas before you came out into the Jewish side. So things have really changed there. And where am I going with this? So the Wailing Wall, when I went there the first time, I went to the left-hand side of the Wailing Wall. And it was really interesting this time to go back to the right-hand side and wearing a shawl and covering myself up and seeing a different perspective on religion and how the women were versus how you're looking over the wall to see the bar mitzvahs and all the other things going on, or the other celebrations going on around the male Orthodox Jews with their hats and the ringlets and everything else and the big coats. So it's really, really interesting to understand the culture as a woman and how that works in Jewish society, how there's a lot of exclusion of women from a lot of the religious ceremonies. There are a lot of very men-only temples and stuff or where people pray. So, yes, it's really interesting to get a different perspective on that culture between two genders.
Well, and it even goes beyond that, because some of them, and I think this is the true across, I'm going to say many religions. It's certainly true across both Islam and Judaism, that the more observant, religious, fanatical one is about one's religion, the more exclusion there is and the more focus there is on the male role as opposed to the female role, and the more, and this is the limited diversity there is. But even within a religion, and we see this with the Shiites and Sunni Muslims, we see this across the different levels of religious observance within the Jewish community, both in Israel and around the world, that effectively there's discrimination against those who don't do everything. I went to a Jewish secondary school because my parents had limited ability to teach me very much about the religion. And I remember I came away feeling I'd been discriminated against because we didn't belong to an Orthodox synagogue grouping. Now, bear in mind, in the UK, there are sort of 4 different levels of belonging to a Jewish, to a synagogue group, or you might not belong to one at all. But even those who actually, there's possibly more than 4 or 5. I won't bother boring you with them. But even those that belong to an ostensibly Orthodox group may not be practicing in an Orthodox way, following all the laws. It's just what they've done traditionally. But because I didn't belong to that group, I had religious studies teachers who, and I still remember, who looked down on me because my family had chosen a different level of practice and observance. And I think that turned me off the whole thing for quite a while. So, I've equally heard that there, well, if I know there are plenty of black Jews around the world, not just in Israel, but in the UK and America and elsewhere, who suffer discrimination. They suffer discrimination because they're black, racists, also because they're white, anti-Semites, but sadly they also suffer racism amongst the Jewish community, who are for the same racist reasons that you can be that apply in any community, and like all these things, invariably it comes down to a lack of education, lack of understanding, lack of knowledge.
And this is where this word we were talking about before went live, intersectionality plays into, where someone is suffering discrimination, A, because they're black, B, because they're Jewish, and C, because they're a different ethnicity of Jewishness. And I became hyper aware of this when I was in Israel, about how the Filipino Jewish people within Israel tend to be the lower paid, domestic role type people. And there was a different way of talking about the Russian Jews who were there, and also the people who were born in Israel who had taken part in national service, versus people who had emigrated there and didn't do national service. Yeah. There's a whole hierarchy of Jewishness within their society and bias and discrimination that went on.
Yeah.
And I remember having this fantastic conversation with a rabbi. He had his skull cap on. He had what I would describe as typically a rabbi look about him. That my bias, sort of, this is what I think a rabbi should look like type prejudice or perception. And we're having this fantastic chat. He said, "Yeah, I know people think because I'm a rabbi, I want to be really serious, and I've got to, you've got to talk to me like I'm some sort of saint. But no, I'll have a beer with you and have a drink with you, and we'll have a good chat." And it was a really good. I think we probably spoke for an hour and a half, just having a real chat about life, the universe, and everything like you do, and completely dismissed any perception I might have about a person of his position within the faith, and it was just a very relatable, fun human being. So I think I've enriched myself quite a lot around the world, meeting different people, and that's the way we change perceptions.
Absolutely,
meet different people.
Yeah, very, very much so. And yeah, I look back. The first trans person I met was at the Magic Circle many years ago, and they were a few years older than me, and they were quite angry at the way they'd been mistreated and discriminated against over their life. And I had tremendous sympathy for them. And it was some years later before I met other trans people, either in the magic world or in the speaking world. And realized that not everybody is angry, or not everybody is visibly, overtly, consistently angry. But equally, so one of the related to that is within the PSA, Professional Speaking Association. And I mentioned to my wife that I did know more trans people than her. She's met trans people through her work over the years. We said, but could that be because they are attracted to speaking and they are speaking about their experiences and lessons that could be learned or whatever? I said, that is one of the reasons. However, 2 members of the PSA became members of the PSA and are not trans, but have children who are transitioning or who have transitioned. And both had joined the PSA long before their children expressed a desire to transition. And what that tells me is it is far more common than we might have been led to believe. And that was even more eye-opening, I think, than the number of trans people that I've actually met.
I think I know the 2 ladies you're talking about who have trans children. Yeah. I've had conversations with both of them, and often when I'm doing a gig, some of the gigs I do are around trans awareness. So it's kind of obvious you're going to get people in the audience who've come deliberately because they want to be educated or they have a trans interest. But often I do other gigs, and it's surprising. I went to Toastmasters for several years. I met people who had a trans relative or a trans story. I've had friends in my old life who've got suddenly, when I became open about myself, suddenly everyone say, "Oh, my neighbour, my friend, my this." So I find that I think we're only 1 or 2 degrees or 1 degree away from someone who knows someone who's trans in their family or in their life. So it is more common that people believe, and it's not just around the trans people, it's around the people who know that trans person, around people who support them or their work colleagues or whatever.
I have a friend of a friend who was an identical twin, and his identical twin sadly passed in his, I think, mid-50s. But had identified as trans and was planning to transition before he suffered a brain tumor. And this was long before I knew the friend of a friend, but apparently for some time, the perception amongst the family was the brain tumor must have been affecting him, and that's what caused it. There was a big concern. The friend of the friend, who's the surviving twin, couldn't grasp and understand this because they were identical twins. How could they have different feelings? There's such different feelings in this regard when apparently in everything else their feelings were so similar. It's fascinating, but it's very close.
Yeah. But if you look at a lot of the language, a lot of the way people see the world, if you're not disabled, if you're straight, you're not gay, if you're not trans, if you're all these things, what you're not tends to be wrong, bad, evil, needs to be fixed. So non-trans people want to fix trans people. So we need to put methods in place so that trans people don't be trans. Well, why don't we make it so that trans people can be trans?
Absolutely.
And it's no big deal.
Yeah.
Then in the same way we talk about the social model of disability, I also talk about the social model of discrimination. It's society that puts the barriers in place based on this normality that we've propagated, the social constructs of normality. And you see people doing DNA or sequencing and research and say, well, we found what causes Down syndrome. We can stop ever having Down syndrome children in the future. Whilst I accept from my normal brain kind of perspective is that I can see the advantage of not having Down syndrome people, not putting people through that. But that means denying that child the opportunity to life, denying that child the opportunity to have great parents to look after them. And why do we see Down syndrome as being wrong? Bad, evil, needs fixing. Someone who's deaf, do we need to fix someone who's deaf, or do we need to make sure that they can celebrate their life in the way they want to live it? So I'm very, very wary that sometimes that we end up framing it so that anyone who's not typical needs to be fixed or needs to be helped, or there's some benevolence out there. We need to stop that ever happening again. I think we went through these conversations where people who are gay, people who are black, people with disability, people who are deaf. We're having the same conversation now about people who are trans, saying we need to fix people so they don't become trans, rather than saying let's embrace people.
Absolutely,
make it a choice. So you can live your life if that's who you are. Go and live your life, and there's no barriers.
Was it another speaker who we both know gave a talk a couple of years ago at the PSA annual convention and talked about, was it an Indian culture that has 20 or
Vicky Arundel. Yeah, there's cultures around the world. What happened was, obviously, the Western world, England, Spain, et cetera, exported Catholicism, Protestant faith, religion, Christianity around the world, and with that came prejudice, bigotry, and the white way with a W, the white way of doing things. Our social construct, our hierarchy, our government, which I'm not saying some of that didn't benefit the cultures, but it also left a legacy of racism, sexism, and straight, homophobia and transphobia. So still a lot of the Commonwealth still have anti-LGBT laws, which we exported to them.
Which is very sad.
India, you mentioned India. The Hijra in India were quite a revered sort of third gender, and they were celebrated. And now they're kind of marginalized. They live in their own little corralled houses, bought out to initiate ceremonies, and almost like packed back off. Gosh. So they're still stigmatized. They're not mainstream. They're still kind of seen as outsiders. Whereas several hundred years ago, before the British arrived, they were kind of part of society in the same way that other trans or third gender or dual gender or fluid people in other civilizations are still celebrated. If you look at the Aboriginals and you look at the Maoris, you look at some of the North American native First Nation people in North America, they have this sort of concept of multiple genders. There's no fixed binary. How they talk about gender is not in this binary male-female sense. There's probably 5 or 6 different ways of expressing yourself, and none of those are male or female. So we have this invention that we created.
And I it's always helpful being reminded of that, because I think we have a tendency to assume that what we know is right. As you said before, anybody who's different is wrong. And I'm more, as I said before, I'm more aware of that because there's an element of me that is different. And it's very frustrating when you hear nonsense being spoken by those in power who don't understand these things and have never experienced any form of bias or discrimination, and perpetuate the idea that we should all be the same and we should all do things the way it's always been done. I'm fascinated to have my mind being opened to a broader awareness of diversity within the world in all ways, shapes and forms, and to reducing the discrimination. Bottom line is, we're still going to choose to spend time with people we can relate to. I don't spend much time with people who are into football or cricket or rugby, and that marks me out as being that marks me out as being more different to most blokes than anything else about me. But equally, it means I relate better to those other blokes and women and people of no preferred gender. I'll try and get the terminology right, but I won't always succeed. But at least I'm trying. I'm more likely to find something in common with people who are not heavily sports orientated. That doesn't make me wrong. I won't insult those who are into sports.
Yeah. But that is one thing that makes a professional speaking association, as an example, or Toastmasters or other interest clubs, if you like, or organisations, because you do cut through a whole cross-section of society. Yeah. You could be a football supporter and a cricket supporter or a rugby fan, but our common interest is speaking, educating, training, standing up in front of people, using our voice and brain to earn a living, not our hands, sort of thing. That's kind of what binds us together. Yeah. And we're quite a diverse bunch. We have people from lots of different sectors, a fair gender balance.
Very much.
Maybe we're still a little bit too white. We need to work on our ethnicity balance and make sure that we are being open to that, and also maybe looking at younger generation about how people are earning money through YouTube and online. But 2020 has given us an example now of how we can earn money online. Because maybe professional speaking was always seen as stage speaking, wasn't it? But now I think we're more open to the concept that speaking as an activity can happen online or face to face. So maybe we'll open up to more the modern YouTubers and the online marketers. So
it's true. It's also true of local business networking events as well. It's all too easy to. Yeah, I like to be a welcoming person whenever I'm at an event whether I'm a host or not. I go and talk to people I don't know, people who are there for the first time. There's a temptation to go up to people who you feel you're going to get on with and relate to and have something in common with. And you step out your comfort zones sometimes and go and talk to somebody less likely. And I'm thrilled at some of the relationships that I've developed over the years because I've stepped out of what historically might have been my comfort zone. I encourage others to do the same.
That reminds me, I was speaking at a conference in London last year, and the organisers had put on some graffiti artists making a graffiti wall with big spray paints and spray cans, and they're inviting the delegates to go and spray and fill it in different bits and then sign their name in the bit they filled in. And I saw these two guys looking like typical, your prejudicial stereotype graffiti artists with beanie hats and sort of boots and shaggy trousers and all this kind of sort of, as you'd imagine, sort of like your graffiti artist stereotype to be. And I started having a chat with him. It turns out that one had run £1 billion businesses and he got tired of it and decided to get out of it. And he found street art, and he said they've decided to legitimize what they're doing because they found it a bit tricky. They kept having near misses of getting arrested for doing it on public walls. So now they set up this business to corporates where they turn up with graffiti walls and create an event graffiti.
Fantastic.
And invite delegates. And so they're proper business people. And I probably spent about an hour and a half talking to them. And I chatted to some people at the end of the conference because I was talking about diversity and inclusion. I just happened to say, has anybody else in the room had a chat with the graffiti artists yet? And there was no hands on them. I said, well, you should do. They're fantastic people. Why have we chosen to network with ourselves and not with them? Because they're seen as the hired help. They're seen as different, whatever. So often by talking to people that are not the obvious choice in your network, actually you can meet some fantastic people.
Totally.
And I've had some really, really enlightening conversations with people that I've just gone up and said hello to.
No, me the same, and I encourage everybody to do it. Overcome your personal prejudices and bias. And it's like anything. I said before, practice makes permanent. Practice can certainly make an improvement and change things for the better if you give it a go.
For sure. I've got to ask you, you've got a nickname of Bookmark Lee. Do you want to tell people what's that about?
Yeah, well, when I thank you for asking. When I first went freelance and I was thinking about what domain name to choose, my name, Mark Lee, is amazingly common. There was an actor, Mark Lee, who appeared in the film Gallipoli with Mel Gibson. He's now an actor-director. There are various American sports stars. There's a Philippine comedian, a Chinese rap artist, just to name a few. The first astronaut to go into space with his wife, whatever that means, was also Mark Lee. So I wasn't going to get a domain name for myself. And the first idea was to go with askmarklee.co.uk. And then a friend remembered that some years previously I'd been thinking of creating a promotional flyer for entertaining at gigs for grown-ups in the days when I did that sort of thing, and that the designer had included a tear-off magic wand that could also be used as a bookmark. And that idea evolved to become, well, how about Bookmarkly? Because that's what I wanted people to do. So I took the website bookmarkly.co.uk. For the benefit of those listening in colour, I'm holding up a coloured bookmark, which is my business card in the days when we used to give out business cards, in the shape of a bookmark. And that's been through various evolutions over the years. And my name on LinkedIn, in terms of my my personalised URL on LinkedIn is Bookmarkly. Facebook business page is Bookmarkly. Twitter handle Bookmarkly. So it hasn't happened recently, but every now and again I used to get emails addressed "Dear Book."
Dear Book.
and then because invariably it was an assistant who would come back and apologise 2 minutes later and go, "Sorry, it's Mark, isn't it?" Which, frankly, I always prefer that to when somebody addresses me as Lee by mistake, because, again, the name switches backwards and forwards as well. So that's the origin of why some people refer to me as Bookmarkly. It makes me more memorable. I live up to it.
It does. And that's magic, as I say.
Absolutely. Find the magic.
Find the magic.
I'm going to use that. I haven't used it before, but I'm going to.
Yeah, find the magic. Yeah. Well, this is the point in the episode where I normally say, how do people get in contact with you? But I think we've established that bookmarkly.co.uk is a very good way, or search for Bookmarkly on Google. They'll come across you. You're the inspiring founder of the Tax Advice Network, author of the Magic of Success. Is that a weekly mail shot?
Weekly mail shot, primarily for accountants, bookkeepers, and tax advisors. The Tax Advice Network. About a year ago now, I also have the domain findataxadvisor.online, because that makes it clearer what it actually is. So if you go to findataxadvisor.online, if you want to find one, then it's a great place to do that. And I'm chairman of the network.
Fantastic. That's absolutely amazing. Well, it's been an inspiration talking to you. We've had a bit of a laugh and a giggle as well. And you're certainly not a boring old accountant, as you're far more fun as a magician, a social media, your presence on social media. You're quite big on LinkedIn at the moment. People can find you there. So there's much to take inspiration from. So a huge thank you to the listeners for tuning in and listening all the way to the end. Please do subscribe to keep updated on future episodes of the Inclusion Bites podcast. That's BITES. Tell your friends if you have any, and your colleagues. I'm sure they'd love to listen to, because I've got a number of exciting guests. More exciting? No, it can't be more exciting, but we've got more guests lined up that I'm sure you'll be inspired by over the next few weeks and months. And remember also, if you'd like to be a guest, if you think you're exciting, think you're inspirational, then please do drop me a line and tell me your story. I welcome any feedback and suggestions you may have, how we can improve the show, to joe.lockwood@seechangehappen.co.uk. And finally, my name is Joanne Lockwood. It has been an absolute pleasure to host this podcast for you today. Catch you next time. Bye.